Hello. Good morning, everyone. Well, we've done 4 lectures of extinctions past and present, and I think maybe some of you are feeling a little bit down. It's been doom and gloom, and I hope that this final lecture will uplift you a bit, because this lecture is supposed to be about what you as a person can do, what we as humankind can do to help our planet. And we have a wonderful expert here. We have Professor Gillson, who is from the Department of Biological Sciences. And Lindsay has interesting research. She looks at paleoecological changes that have happened over time. So she's mainly working in more the recent realm compared to deep time like me, but her work has been fascinating. And she's going to tell you about her research as well as what we as people can do to make things better. Lindsay is originally from the UK. She did her undergraduate at Oxford University, her master's. Oh, that reminds me. Please, can you put off your cell phones? Okay. So Lindsay has her master's degree from Imperial College in London, and then she has her doctorate at Oxford University. And her research has taken her to wonderful places in Africa, looking at savanna, and she's worked in Tanzania, in Zambia, Madagascar, and nowadays, of course, her main research focus is here in South Africa, and particularly in the Kruger. Yeah. Is that correct? Yes. Okay, and so I think we are really fortunate to have an expert like Lindsay here, and I hand it over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Anusha. So, morning everybody. So I've been here all week as well, and also feeling slightly disheartened by everything. So I'm hopefully today going to present a more positive view. And my take, as Anusha is explained, is using the past to manage the future. So what we know now in ecology is nothing's in balance. Everything's changing all the time. So rather than panicking every time we see something change, we must rather look at the resilience of ecosystems and see if we're working within that resilience or whether we're getting near a dangerous tipping point. And that does give us more leeway than just panicking every time something changes, okay? So that's my kind of big message about landscapes. So as we've heard this week, we are in the middle of a mass extinction event, which has been equaled only 5 times before, we think, in the Earth's history. And Anusha's lecture on Monday explained all of those extinctions. But the big difference is those past events were nothing to do with people. We don't know what caused them all exactly, but they were to do with changing climate, volcanism, maybe meteor impacts, and changing atmospheric and ocean chemistry. Whereas the 6th extinction we're experiencing now is driven by humans. So I think that gives us a special responsibility. So there is some optimism, as Anusha told you. Once there's an extinction, there's also massive radiation afterwards. But the trouble is now the rate of extinction is so fast. And we are seeing evidence of microevolution. So species are starting to adapt to changing climates, for example. But we're going too quickly. So what we have to look at is how to build resilience of our ecosystems. So just a quick recap. You know this already by now. The driving factors of extinctions are things like habitat destruction, overhunting and overexploitation, as we heard about the marine systems yesterday. Alien species are a big problem. And then we get chains of linked extinctions, which are known as trophic cascades. So you'll remember when we heard about Madagascar, with the extinction of the elephant birds, right, by people, what happened after that was that the eagles that prey on the elephant birds also went extinct because they had no prey. So we have these trophic cascades that are leading to chains of linked extinctions. Jared Diamond has called these 4 drivers the evil quartet. But all things are even worse, because now, on top of all of this, we're also dealing with climate change, which is a big potential threat to ecosystems and species. We don't know exactly what's going to happen. There's best and worst case scenarios. You can see the range of variability in this graph, depending on how we go economically and how well we manage to shift away from carbon-based economies will determine the impact of the magnitude of climate change. And then what we also have to think about is extinction synergies. So for example, a species that lives in a highly fragmented landscape like that will be more vulnerable to climate change because it's got less resilience. So we have to think about, and the same as a species that lives in a very highly invaded or transformed habitat, it will be more vulnerable. So we have these synergies between stressors that stress both species and the whole systems that they depend on. So it's all so far so gloomy. What can be done? Well, you've heard throughout the week of different things that are happening. So for example, if we think about habitat destruction, we can maybe think about extending the protected areas network. We can try and reduce overhunting and overexploitation. So it might be measures like anti-poaching. It might be educating consumers about their choices and what they buy, for example. Or it might be making sure people have different livelihood streams so that when a species becomes depleted, they have something else to live on. So it might be things like that. When we think about introduced species and also habitat destruction, we can also, some very exciting innovations about restoration and rewilding, and I'll talk a bit more about that. And if we do all that, we might have a chance of having some impact on the trophic cascades that I've just mentioned. Obviously, climate change, we need to think about low carbon economies, ideally moving towards zero carbon economies if we possibly could. And if we do that, then there'll be less stress and we might be able to do something about extinction synergies. So there are some positive things we can do, but there's a caveat to all that. So first of all, our protected area network, and this is terrestrial, not including marine, covers only 12% of the land surface. And what's tended to happen as we transform landscapes is that protected areas become like islands. So we've heard about island biogeography. So they're not connected anymore to other populations and areas of habitat. And that's a problem, especially because as climate warms, species tend to track their suitable climate space. So in general, this isn't a strict rule, but in general, they'll tend to move poleward and upward to keep track of suitable climate space. So they might actually be moving out of protected areas. So that's also a problem which reduces the effectiveness of our protected area network. So you can imagine if our protected area is somewhere here, and the future climate space is at a higher altitude or latitude, and the species needs to move here, and this is an urban area, then that's a problem, okay? So, and we also have this synergetic effect where species and populations become less resilient the more stresses they're experiencing. And the fear is that as we continue to transform landscapes, we might get to this critical point where populations or ecosystems just aren't viable anymore. And the worry is we're going to hit a critical transition and the whole thing's going to collapse. You might have read Jared Diamond's Collapse, right? That's the kind of idea. So this is a worst case kind of scenario. Don't worry, I'm going to get more optimistic later. On similar lines, this was a very famous paper by Rockstrom, which came out in 2009. So what Rockstrom et al. Have tried to do, and I think this moves the debate forward significantly, is work out how near we are to those boundaries. So how much leeway have we actually got? So it's not to make us complacent and not do anything. I think it's the opposite. It's like, while we've got the chance to do something, let's get on with it before it's too late. But what you can see here is what Rockstrom et al. Did was look at various environmental changes. And what you can see here in terms of biodiversity loss, we're just going way too fast. We're going too fast for evolution to compensate for those species we're losing. So we're not doing very well there. Climate change, we still have a bit of buffering capacity, but obviously things aren't looking good and we mustn't be complacent. Other things, according to this paper, we're doing surprisingly well. So according to Rockstrom, global fresh water, we're not doing too badly. So anyway, I won't worry too much about the details, but you can see the thing that's emerging in the literature is working with variation and tipping points. So this kind of idea, I think, is very important. Because the alternative is to just say everything's changed and it's all bad. You know, this gives us another framework to work with, so I think that's important. Another way of framing this, and we've heard the term used throughout the week, is that we're in the new geological era called the Anthropocene. And this is defined by unprecedented levels of human influence, so on climate, on species, on ecosystem transformation. And there's various debates about when the Anthropocene starts. You could argue, as perhaps Pete Ryan told you on Tuesday, I think, the extinctions that started in the early Holocene, they had massive impacts on, so the loss of the mammoths, for example, had massive impacts on ecosystems. So that was a very big anthropogenic effect. You could also look at the 18th century when industrialization really took off and see that as a starting point. But a paper came out that just this week seems to be suggesting that the start of the Anthropocene is actually around 1950 when we had this massive acceleration of industrialization and putting plastics into the atmosphere. And if you think about the geological layers, which Anusuya showed you on Monday, ours might be defined by a layer of plastic, right? So we could be in a new geological era. And again, instead of panicking about that, I think an interesting way to think about it is, how do we make a good Anthropocene? If we accept that we're in charge now and we're the main driver, how do we work with that and make a good, hopefully a good Anthropocene? Yes? Sure. Yeah. So, no, is that better?
Is that better? And here we go.
A bit more. Ah, there you go. Perfect. Okay, is that good? Okay, so you might think we're driving ourselves towards our own extinction, but even if we do, other species will carry on. But anyway, let's hope that we don't do that. And let's think about a new way of doing conservation, rather, that is appropriate to where we are in the Anthropocene. So as I've said, the protected area network is enough. Don't get me wrong, it's pivotal to conservation. It provides crucial areas of protection from habitat change. It provides source populations. It's absolutely critical. But it's not going to work on its own. We also need to think about broader changes in terms of consumption, water management, food production, to keep our activities within a safe operating space, as Rockstrom coined the term. So if we now move away from the biologist view to a more integrated view of conservation as part of sustainable development, what the recent Sustainable Development Goals say is that we have to meet the needs of present and future generations, but we also need to support the resilience of the ecosystems which give us those resources that we need. So a very important concept, I think, in the Anthropocene is the concept of ecosystem services. So although it's important to look after our endangered, critically endangered species, especially if they're, emblems like the panda, it's very important to do that, but it's not going to be enough on its own. We also need to think about processes, so ecological processes, evolutionary processes. So in other words, to keep the environment working in a healthy way. And a way to motivate that is to think that if we don't do this, we're going to miss out on the ecosystem services that we need. So I think ecosystem services is a very important concept to move conservation out of just the natural history enthusiasts, which perhaps a lot of us are, and we're important, but into a kind of more mainstream of development and policy making. So if you can see here the ecosystem services that are being defined, they're things like supporting ecosystem services. So this is things like soil formation and primary production. Provisioning services are things like food, so fisheries, also wood for fuel. And there are also things like pollination. So again, going back to the idea of cascades, if we take out a pollinator, then whatever it pollinates is in trouble too. We also have regulating services, so carbon storage, for example, is very important for regulating the climate. And then we also have another whole suite of ecosystem services, which are cultural. So they are things like people's sense of place and how they identify with the environment, and do they care about it enough to look after it. There are aesthetic concerns, there are recreational concerns. And all these are really important because people have different motivations for caring about conservation. And basically we need everything in the toolbox, right? So I think it's good. This is a good framework for engaging as many people as possible, because let's face it, everyone on this planet depends on ecosystem services. Without primary production, no one would have any food, right? So if you can get people thinking in that way, in that we're all dependent on a functioning ecosystem for all of these things that make for a good life, then I think it's easy to engage more broadly. You know, it's quite abstract to say we must save a panda, you know, that you might never get to see. But I think everyone can relate to this kind of framework. Don't worry about all the details. It's just that I want you to get a feeling of this should appeal to everybody, because everyone wants good well-being. Okay, so the message now, so moving on to what can we do do need to think about consumption patterns and land management. So this is my kind of landscape focus. If we're going to keep ecosystems functioning and keep within those, within the safe operating space. So if we go back to our map of the Anthropocene, these are changes in land cover. And what you can see is this dark green here is the amount of wildlands, which has been, so unmanaged lands. So this has been declining quite steadily since the mid-Holocene, where we have the advent of agriculture and, you know, lots of extinctions of large mammals, etc. And what you can see instead of wildlands is we have these semi-natural lands, which I'm going to talk more about, so things like wood pastures, rangelands, and then we have croplands and we have urban areas. So thinking about where are our conservation opportunities, well, we can do some rewilding, and I'll talk a little bit about that, but that's going to be relatively minor in the face of population growth and hunger and poverty. So I would argue that our conservation opportunities are rather in this block here, which is semi-natural lands, rangelands, and croplands. So this is where I think we're going to buffer species and help prevent extinctions by managing these parts of the Earth's surface much better. So there's a debate over how best to do this, and this you can simply, the simplest way to explain it is land sharing versus land sparing. So we have only 12% of land under protected areas and 40% under food production. So the argument is, should we produce food as intensively as possible in as small an areas as possible so that we can have more protected areas, and that's called land sparing, or should we use integrated wildlife-friendly farming methods, so focusing on that rangeland semi-natural bit of the Anthropocene map, so that we can combine some biodiversity conservation with food production, and that's called land sharing. So what does this look like in real life? Well, this is the wheat belt of Australia, and what you can see here is intensively farmed areas and then bits of wildlife habitat. And at the other extreme, this is a system from Costa Rica where the forest canopy is largely intact and people grow their crops underneath it in small patches. So you have a kind of integrated mix of food production and biodiversity. And somewhere in the middle, this one's from the Loire Valley in France, and what you can see here, there are some areas of cultivation, but there's also continuity. So if you're a woodland species, you can move through this landscape along rivers and hedgerows. So this is a kind of good in-between kind of model. So it's actually a continuum. Land sharing versus land sparing is a bit of a simplification. So we have these different landscape options. Just to explore that a bit more, there's quite a different philosophy about land sparing compared with land sharing. So if you think about land sparing, the landscape's very binary. We either have nature or we have food, and there's not much in between, whereas land sharing, it's more integrated. In land sparing, there's an aim of an equilibrium, which is to keep maximum productivity in some areas and wilderness in other areas. I don't believe anything ever stays the same, so I'm not sure how realistic that is. Whereas land sharing is more about resilience and a whole range of ecosystem services. Land sparing depends on reserves to keep viable populations, whereas land sharing is more about processes. So can small populations actually meet up and share genes by moving across the landscape, for example? And then philosophically, it's quite different. So do we consider humans part of nature or separate from nature? And the solutions we have under these two philosophies are, if we believe land sparing is the way to go, then, okay, so you want to improve production, then you put in more fertilizers, more pesticides, more irrigation. You use those technological solutions. Whereas in land sharing, we accept that the environment is changing a lot and we keep having to adapt our food production systems as the environment changes. So for example, we might have a whole range of crops with different drought sensitivities. If we know it's going to be a dry year, we can plant more drought-sensitive crops. Or farmers might choose to plant a whole range so that they know they're going to have some sort of crop. So they're very different approaches. You can probably see where I'm going with this and my bias by now. But anyway, does land sparing actually work? So one could argue that food production's not actually the problem. Globally, we've got enough food for everybody. We waste a third of it through bad storage, bad distribution, and households throwing things away. And we feed a lot to animals as well, which if you remember your trophic levels, every time you move a trophic level, you lose a lot of energy from the system. So it's more efficient to cut down on meat consumption if we want to use our calories wisely. Another aspect of this is that where intensive systems work, a lot of the food is for exports. So they're cash crops. For example, in Kenya, there's a lot of, sugar snap peas and things. So they're expensive, they're valuable, and they're exported. So they don't actually help local food security. Whereas if we look at the other side of the coin, where food security is poorest, tends to be in areas where low-intensity farming is practiced. And it's therefore, if we want to improve food security rather than food production, it's those areas where we need to do the work. And the other big argument is that, one of the underlying assumptions of land sparing is that if we produce food intensively, we'll take land out of production and put it into reserves, and that's not actually what's happening. What's happening is that the margins on cash crops are so small that to make a farm viable, the farms have to be huge. So we're actually eating up more land to produce food intensively. Some areas also just aren't suitable for intensive farming. For example, they're too dry, they're more suitable to rangelands. And then the other big driver we have at the moment is land grabbing for things like soy and oil palm. So crops that aren't anything to do with local food security. So there's a lot of different forces at work that makes land sparing, in my opinion, a problematic approach. Just to go back to that statistic about food wastage, what you can see here, this shocking statistic, in North America and Oceania, 1,500 calories per day are wasted per person. That's almost enough to feed another person. So that's quite something. There's much less waste in other areas, so here's sub-Saharan Africa. But this is a huge amount of calories that we're just wasting. And we could rather focus on that maybe, rather than producing more food and wasting more of that. Anyway, so that's an option. This is what happens to biodiversity when you intensify food production. So on this axis here, this is our biodiversity and ecosystem services. Now, if we start planting intensive crops, the first thing we normally do is clear the land. So you get a massive plummet in the amount of biodiversity and ecosystem services. And there's basically nowhere for biodiversity to live in those landscapes. So we're reinforcing the protected areas as islands in a sea of inhospitable land. If we go the other route, we can maintain more biodiversity and ecosystem services. And it's only when we, right at the high end of the land sharing, where we actually run into problems with biodiversity. Biodiversity is pretty good at being accommodated in this other system. So if we look at the ecosystem services that we have, this is an intensive food production system. And here are our ecosystem services, things like food production, water regulation, carbon sequestration, biodiversity, soil formation, aesthetic values, and recreation. If we have intensive food production systems, all we get is food. If we have low-intensity agriculture, we also get, as well as quite a lot of food, we also get things like opportunity for recreation, because people like those landscapes more because they look nice. It's better for soils, it's better for biodiversity, and it's not too bad for carbon sequestration. So you can see that we have a trade-off here. Maybe there is a place for some intensive areas of food production, but I think in general we will do better and we will build better resilience if we go for a broad suite of ecosystem services. Okay, so we're used to hearing about all these terrible things that people do, and they do happen. We've heard a lot about that this week. And lots of things have been mentioned: pollution, hydroelectric schemes, alien species. But if we think about sustainability, these are largely associated with industrial scale technologies of the Anthropocene. When we do have another way of managing landscapes that still does exist in parts of the world. So some traditional management systems can be associated with much smaller scale disturbance, and they can be more compatible with biodiversity conservation and maintaining ecosystem services. So now to think about wildlife friendly farming, there's some characteristics. So for example, rotating land uses, having mixed livestock, cropland and forestry. So you end up with a landscape that still has some areas for biodiversity, and it's also got connective areas so that populations don't become genetically isolated, as well as more intensive areas for growing crops. And the characteristics of those systems are low inputs, so low fertilizer input, low pesticide application, and more labor. And the nice thing about these systems is that they've usually evolved in place, and they're usually adaptable to the range of variation in environment that people are used to experiencing. So they, in other words, they embody local knowledge, and they are embedded in local institutions. They have tended in the past to be orientated towards subsistence, but that's now changing. And this is also a good opportunity, I think. So there's now various certification schemes where you can get a very high price for selling a small amount of your products. For example, artisan cheeses or leather products, or there's a certification scheme in Namibia for cheetah-friendly meat, for example. So people can up the value of their product by doing environmentally sensitive food production. So just to talk a bit more about these low-intensity landscapes, this is a graphic that shows, these are from Morocco, these systems, they're Achtal. What happens is you have a village, usually in a valley bottom, and the intensive crop cultivation occurs near the river because it's easy to water things, obviously. And then as we move away, people might have orchards near the village as well, and then they move into things like where they might need some forests, so they don't have to carry the timber too far. And then far away, you've got seasonal grazing. So this kind of landscape evolves naturally out of the way people use the landscape. And these systems are actually proving very effective. If we compare an Achtal managed area to a non-managed area, the tree cover is much higher, and the tree cover is regenerating much better. And this is quite a similar pattern, and it makes sense. This pattern of land use has evolved multiple times over the surface of the earth. So this is from Romania. I also showed you the system from the Loire Valley. And you can see it's obvious, it's the same thing. We have a riverine corridor, croplands next to it because you can water, and then moving away you have less and less intensive land use. So this to me makes sense both in terms of geomorphology and also socially in terms of how people use the land and manage their labor. And you might be surprised to know that some of these agrarian landscapes are actually more resilient and more biodiverse than not only industrially managed areas, which you might expect, but also sometimes they are more biodiverse than wilderness areas. And I'm going to say more about that later. They're more likely to be sustainable. The reason they're still here is that they've managed to stay viable for a long time, and they've also managed to adapt to change. Things weren't static in the past. That's the problem with the word traditional. It implies stuck, and it's actually not. These systems are always adapting. So going back to this point about biodiversity, so at the start of the Holocene, this interglacial, we'd already lost a lot of our large mammals, and so forests became dominated by closed canopy forests. And this meant that lots of the shade-intolerant species and disturbance-adapted species were in decline. Biodiversity actually went up when people started managing forests from the mid-Holocene onwards. They started clearing areas, and that recreated those habitats, which used to have been maintained by large mammals, now extinct. So then people started opening up the forest canopy and creating a broader range of habitats. So they're actually higher in species richness than so-called wilderness forests. Also, we see examples of fire management. So lots of ecosystems are fire adapted. Fire is a natural part of their ecosystem. And when people manage fire, those systems can also become more biodiverse. The reason being that people can start small early season burns, which prevents huge late season burns. So instead of a whole area being burnt very intensely late in the dry season, you get a mosaic of different burn ages. So over time, you can imagine there's always a patch that's just been burned, one that was burnt last year, one, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And that is going to be a more diverse landscape than one that just burns massively every kind of 10 years, 20 years, 50 years. So that's also been shown to be very good for biodiversity, that sort of management. So a lot of these land use systems are aimed towards maintaining a range of ecosystem services, and that means keeping a whole range of habitats, some forest elements, some grazing and grassland elements. And this is why they accommodate more biodiversity. And you might think these systems are dying out, and they are indeed struggling in some areas. I'll talk more about that. But I'm not going to go through all these examples, but there are many, many examples of systems that are still working very well. For the Achdal in Morocco is one that I've talked about. What am I doing for time? Okay. All right. So if we hopefully have established now that managed landscapes can be good for biodiversity, but I've also mentioned that some of these traditional systems are also breaking down. So what happens then? So what tends to happen is that once people stop managing forests, the canopy tends to close up again. So we gain in carbon storage, but we lose in biodiversity because we've lost the range of habitats. My field is paleoecology, and when we look at the fossil pollen record in European forests, what we see is that we get this increase in biodiversity as people start managing forests. Then with industrialization, where people abandon their land and move to cities, the biodiversity starts to decline. So maybe that's surprising to you, but maybe it's also encouraging because now we know what ought to happen on these landscapes. So land abandonment, far from always being a good thing for biodiversity, can be quite damaging to biodiversity, and we might lose ecosystem services. So a lot of systems need grazing to keep the open areas. We've lost a lot of the suite of wild herbivores in Europe, at least. In Africa, luckily, we haven't. And so what will happen is those areas will become colonized and eventually become closed forests. And then what can happen with that is you get a different fire regime. So instead of a patchy landscape where fire can't spread, you get this homogeneous landscape with continuous fuel, and you get a change in fire regime. So instead of thinking of people as degraders, we can also think of them as maintainers and protectors. So I want to explore a bit more about land abandonment and why I think it's a conservation problem. So look, in some cases, there just becomes too many people in an area for the system to support. In other cases, what happens is markets open up. So instead of producing only for a local market, which naturally puts a cap on how much resources are produced and extracted, once you start selling outside that area, you've no longer got that check and balance, and so then systems become overexploited. But there's also other drivers. So industrialization pulls people away from rural areas to urban areas. And we also have this big land conversion driver in the Anthropocene, including things like plantation forestry and intensive agriculture. And as I've mentioned, this can make landscapes less patchy and lose the species that are associated with disturbance and open habitats. So just to show you what that actually looks like, this is an example from Tuscany and what happened here when people stopped traditional management. So what Agnelletti et al. Did, they reconstructed landscape patchiness from a range of different sources, mostly historical in this case. You can also add in the pollen record in these kind of studies. And what they managed to do was put together a picture of what the landscape looked like in 1832. And what you can see is this very patchy landscape. So we have elements of woodland. We've also got some arable with vines and trees and chestnut groves and orchards. And then we have pasture areas. And then we have these kind of wood pasture areas, which are mixed trees and grazing. And then what happens with land abandonment is those managed and pasture areas start to be encroached by woodland. So you get a lot more woody areas and also a lot less patchiness. By 2002, the wood encroachment is carried on. And by now, the management techniques like terrace building have all been abandoned. So now terraces are starting to collapse and we're getting landslides going on as well. So you can see, just to go back, here's 1832 and here's 2002. So a lot more homogeneous and also more landscape instability with less people. The dynamics of that are that we're losing meadows and they're basically being converted to forests. So this is land that wasn't forest in 1832 and is now forest in 2002. And it's the upland pastures that are being lost. And this is where we have unique suites of species that are adapted to grassy habitats. What's also been lost from this landscape is chestnut orchards. And this is it's not the species that's under threat, it's the socio-ecological system that's under threat. So chestnuts are very culturally significant. They were used for all sorts of different things. Here they're collecting leaves, which was used as fodder, obviously the chestnuts themselves. So they were a hub of kind of social activity as well as being important biodiversity habitats. So what will need to happen here if they want to keep or restore landscape heterogeneity and keep the whole suite of species is to put back in some of these traditional management systems. I talked a bit about fire. This is from another paper, also from the Mediterranean area of Europe. And what you can see here, here's the rural population density. You can see it plummeting from 1940. So this is, if we take the middle of the 20th century as the start of the Anthropocene, the trend is for urbanization and rural depopulation. What happened with that? This is a record of area burnt, which has been reconstructed from maps and charcoal. And what you can see is, in concert with the lack of people, we've got this big increase in fire, including these massive fire events, which are extremely destructive and cause loss of life. So without people to maintain the landscape, we're actually increasing our hazard risk. What Shakespeare et al. Said is they explained it very nicely in this diagram. So land abandonment was driven by a range of factors in the land themselves, like how remote they were and how inaccessible they were to markets. But there was also a pull of urbanization. Then there was another driver, afforestation. So as people abandoned their land, some plantation forests came up with very high timber value, but they were also monospecific, so very low biodiversity, and also very prone to fire. So these two things in concert, the encroachment of scrub onto abandoned land and the establishment of tree plantations, led to more forest cover, higher fuel load, and more fires. So what he says, we need to start prescribed burns and revegetation and putting back some of this patchiness in the landscape. And what he argues is that we should be looking at the historical range of variability in fire. And I think that's an important concept, using the past to manage the future. So can we look back and get some messages about how we should put things back? So to me anyway, and many others, cultural landscapes are a valid part of our conservation ecosystem. If we only focus on protected areas, I feel we will fail. We have to look outside protected areas. Most species live outside protected areas. We can't ignore the food production sector of our landscapes. So we've got to be creative. We've got to work with. So disturbance is natural in most ecosystems. You get fires, storms, floods. These things happen anyway. So can we, for example, develop timber rotation systems which somehow mimic the pattern of disturbance in a forest? That would be one example of trying to mimic natural processes. So to keep the forest intact in the sense that it's functioning while still getting our ecosystem services out of it. Also, we must listen to the areas where things are still working. So this is where lots of pastoral systems in Africa still work. They have been disrupted by sedentarization, but actually moving in response to environmental change is a very effective thing to do. So to me, reintegrating humans and nature can only be good for conservation. It builds political will, for one thing, if everyone's engaged, and then we can maybe attract more donor funds, and we have hopefully better human well-being. So rather than trying to preserve the past, though, what we need to do is build things from the ground up, so empower local communities to try and strengthen their local institutions and work with systems which are conserving biodiversity effectively. So just a couple of examples of how this has actually been done. In Madagascar, their protected area network is relatively new. So in deciding where to put their national parks, what they did was, instead of looking at a map of biodiversity and drawing lines on a map, they went and talked to communities. And what they found was, for example, in Ankadida, the local community already had a sacred forest that they had been protecting, so they'd been preventing people from cutting it down. They'd been looking after it, but they were worried with the erosion of traditional values that this sacred forest might not be protected well enough anymore. So they were very happy to work with WWF and the Malagasy government to make their sacred forest part of the protected area network. So here we have a nice win-win situation where the local community is reinforced and it adds into the protected area network without that awful conflict that sometimes arises when people are resentful of protected areas in their neighbourhood. So that's one example. Another is, I've already mentioned these certification schemes. So where people are doing things very well in an environmentally friendly way, how can we increase the economic return on what they've done? So certification schemes, for example, are very good because ethical consumers are willing to pay more for goods that are being produced in an environmentally friendly way. So, and this contrast, there are other economic mechanisms like paying people to take land out of production, but to me they're very brittle. As soon as the government changes and those payments stop, where's the continuity? Rather build something that is self-sustaining. So the problem with this, as you probably realized, is that everything's changed. The world is globalized, markets have opened up, we've got more people. So what we can't do is expect people to live in the same systems as they lived in the past. People want different things now. So what we have to do is try and keep the ecological system functioning while accommodating new social systems. So the certification scheme is a good example of that. How do we make a positive future while building on the past? Okay. I think I've talked about all that. So just to sum up some things about land sharing, we have areas that we can't do intensive farming on anyway. We know that these diverse patchy landscapes are good for biodiversity, so they're going to contribute to preventing extinctions as a nice byproduct of giving a range of ecosystem services. Also, going back to my initial slides on why the protected area network is a bit fragile. So I mentioned that species have to move to keep up with suitable climate space. So by having landscapes that are permeable to wildlife, plants and animals, we're also facilitating the adaptation to new climates because we're allowing species to move more effectively. So instead of having a protected area and then a completely inhospitable wheat field or something, we have these integrated landscapes with river corridors and hedgerows, so species can actually keep up more effectively with their appropriate climate envelope. The point about food security. Now, this was a really interesting article that I read a couple of years ago now. So what this says is that because parts of Asia industrialized so quickly, there was a big move towards urbanization. That left the rural areas depopulated. In order to attract people back to work the land and produce food, wages there are actually going up. So according to this article, which was a kind of speculative article, an emerging trend might be people in Asia to move back to farming because you can earn a lot of money there. And that means that the industrial centres will have to move somewhere else. And what this analyst said was that the most likely place for industrialisation to move to was Africa, because we have lots of people and low wages. So what they constructed it as very positive for Africa, so a big chance for more jobs, for example, and higher GDP. So there's all things like this that I think we need to consider when we're thinking about how our landscapes might change over time. And it's also an opportunity. We know urbanization in Africa is happening very quickly. And the nice thing here is we can learn through other urban areas and hopefully try and make good cities, and also foster things like urban agriculture where people can produce food in cities as well. So all very fascinating how all this whole thing fits together. Now, if we go with the urbanization theme for a bit longer, so people are urbanizing, that means rural depopulation. So we can either, for example, in the face of a country like Greece, which has gone through a big economic collapse, one route might be to encourage people back to their traditional lands to produce food there. Another route, which is, there's an environmentalist called George Monbiot, I don't know if you know him, writes very well on this. So what he says is with these drivers and big population fluxes, there's actually also a huge opportunity for rewilding. So in other words, adding to, you know, that tailing off wild areas bit I showed you at the start, he says we can boost that back up by rewilding. And it's going on quite successfully. Wolves are back in Yellowstone. There's some very good restoration projects on islands, which I could talk all day about. They're absolutely fascinating. Large herbivores are being reintroduced to European woodlands to try and get this patch dynamic going again. And then if we look at Africa, we've got this, especially South Africa, we've got this move towards more private game reserves, which if they're well run, could improve connectivity between different parts. So this rewilding is, I think, also very exciting and very positive. It can restore some ecological functions, it can improve gene flow, and again, if we improve landscape connectivity, we've got a bit more resilience to climate change. So just in case you don't know, rewilding is a scientific argument for restoring wilderness based on particularly the regulatory role of large animals. And the argument's changed a lot since the 80s. So it used to be that wilderness was the conservation goal. Now it's kind of more about functionality, keeping ecosystem services flowing. And it's a very big debate. It's very controversial in some areas. But what I wanted to show you was this example of functional rewilding. Because what do we do? How can we rewild if the species is already extinct? So here's an example of what we can do. So again, hopefully another positive message. So this is an example from an island off Mauritius. This island used to be covered in ebony forest. It's an endemic, so in other words, it's unique to this island. And it was once widespread on this island. But what happened was, from the 16th century, all of the large animals, as often happens on islands, they were all killed off. Particularly the large tortoises, which were the seed dispersers, they were all gone. At the same time, lots of the ebony was harvested because it's a very valuable wood. So what happened was the forest became critically endangered, and despite stopping all of the logging and harvesting, the forest just didn't regenerate. And when people did an analysis of why the forest wasn't regenerating, what they found was all the seedlings were only regenerating under the canopy of the parent tree, where they can't actually establish. And this was because of the loss of seed dispersers. However, their main seed disperser is extinct. So what they did was look for a functional equivalent. So this is called functional rewilding. So what they did was they took a very similar type of tortoise from Aldabra, so it's not the right species, but it's ecologically equivalent, and they reintroduced it to the island. And what they found was, so this is a map of the ebony trees, and the grey dots are the ones that have been dispersed. So since reintroducing the tortoises, the forest is now expanding because the seeds can move away from the parent tree and colonize new areas. So what I want you to get from this is even where we've lost a species, it's gone, we can still look for a functional equivalent and do something about it. So we're not helpless in the face of these extinctions. So as I've said, rewilding is controversial, but I think we have a moral responsibility. We drove these extinctions, so I think we have to do something about it, unlike the other extinctions we've heard about. And also we've put in a lot of other stresses on ecosystems, landscape transformation and climate change, obviously. So as I've said, to me, the argument for maintaining ecosystem services is a very powerful driver because hopefully it appeals to everybody. And this feeds into rewilding, but also the agricultural systems that I've talked about. So what I think we should be aiming for in the Anthropocene is multifunctional landscapes. So we have our protected area network, and we must cherish that, it's critical. But we need to embed these protected areas in a better managed landscape. So have buffer zones with low intensity use, make sure we've got connectivity, make sure our food production systems are at least wildlife friendly in some of the areas. And the rationale for this is keeping a wide range of ecosystem services. And I think most people benefit from this. People like these heterogeneous, complex landscapes. And not only that, they feel more connected to them. So being part of a socio-ecological system where you are a steward is actually a big motivator for looking after biodiversity. So in other words, I feel we need to re-engage people with landscapes. Yes, we need to look after our critically endangered species, but we also need people to feel more ownership of taking care of where they live. So can we plant the seeds of a good Anthropocene? I think we can. We have a good protected area network. Some countries are doing really well and have a high percentage of cover. But we also have opportunities for these better water management, more wildlife-friendly agriculture. We have examples of systems that are still running really well, which we can reinforce and build on. And I think we should think at landscape levels. So can we treat the landscape as a unit that provides a whole range of ecosystem services, including looking after biodiversity? And obviously, part of all this is trying to get zero carbon economies. We can do things ourselves, reduce, reuse, recycle, try and use public transport, urban agriculture. You know, all of these things, we can all do something. And although you might feel these are quite detached from preventing extinctions, they're all part of this bigger picture that I hope I've tried to paint. And so what? You know, so what if we don't meet all of our conservation and climate goals? What if we end up with a better world anyway? You know, what if some species go extinct? What if we don't meet our temperature target quite? But we get clean energy, we have more preserved forests, better sustainability, clean water, etc., etc. So why don't we just try? Okay, thank you.
She's just published this book last year. And very nice book.
I'm not sure.
Okay, but basically, there's a very nice book that she's written about biodiversity and environmental change. By this talk, you can get more from the book. But let's take some questions. Some lights on, if we can.
Yeah.
I understand everywhere in the world, the rural populations.
No, so the article that I showed you, so in parts of rural Asia, it's actually increasing as people migrate back to the land for higher wages. So there's always a flux. At the moment, the tendency is towards urbanization, so declining rural population. But there are these push-pull factors, and obviously...
Is it significant in those parts of Asia, or is it just...
It's an emerging trend, yeah.
Because in Africa, it's everywhere.
Yeah, and if this article is correct and urbanization suddenly increases faster in Africa, we're going to get a big pull towards cities. Yeah. Cheetah-friendly meat. Okay, so in order to protect livestock, cheetahs and other predators have been highly persecuted by livestock producers. Now you can use different techniques. So, for example, if you put a donkey in with your livestock, your sheep, the donkey will actually protect the flock from cheetahs. So that's one example. Another thing you can do is you can have a mobile kraal. So when you move your animals around, you tow the kraal and protect them overnight. So it means that you're producing meat in a way that doesn't impact on predators as well. So So there's inertia in the system, and also we don't know about the feedbacks. So even if we stop producing as much carbon, for example, the sea temperature, because it's warming, will release more carbon into the atmosphere. So it's not just about, even if we manage our carbon economies well, there are other processes in the system that might still keep putting carbon into the atmosphere. Also, for example, melting of permafrost might happen, and then we might have a huge input of carbon.
Yes?
Very, very good lecture, thank you. Involved in conservation in the very large systems dynamic.
Yeah.
And to go back to an early part of your lecture, wild farming, I think that was the term. The farm.
Yeah, everything does affect everything else. You know, I don't think we can stop it. What we have to create is feedback loops that are positive.
Yes.
So we reward good behavior. In other words, everything's going to change all the time. What we also need to do is build systems that are flexible and adaptive. And that means things like, so the Kruger National Park has done this really well. They have an adaptive management system. So, for example, in the old days, the equilibrium type ecology, they'd say we want 7,000 elephants in our park, and that was it, that was the goal, and they would cull and keep it there. Now they've realized that we don't know how many elephants there used to be there before they were hunted out, and also we don't know how much tree cover there should be. So they've rather set a range of variability for tree cover. If it meets the upper or lower limit, they'll do something about it. They'll move elephants, they'll manage fire, they'll do something. So I think it's about setting thresholds where we change our behavior. I don't think we can do anything about preventing change. It's how we respond to that change and whether we have systems in place that work with it. Like the one in Kruger is a good system, I think. Yeah, that's also an interesting one. So lots of invasive species have extremely negative effects, as we've seen, but they can also be positive. So alien species, invasive species, they're not quite the same terms. But for example, the tortoise example I gave you, that's an alien species, but it's fulfilling a function. And if we think about it on a more kind of geological timescale, everything's invaded from somewhere. You know, a lot of the world was covered in northern hemisphere was covered in ice until not so very long ago, so everything moved in. So the idea of not being afraid of novel ecosystem assemblages, that's what they're called. So we will get species mixing in new combinations, but what we're also going to get is new combination of climatic parameters as well. So maybe it's completely appropriate that things move and recombine. Yes, it is extraordinary. So for those of you who haven't read about it, it was an amazing story. So the wolves were wiped out in the 1920s, I believe. And what happened then was, without a top predator like that, the elk population absolutely exploded. They prevented the regeneration of riverine trees. What happened then was you lost, the beavers moved out because they lost cover. Without the beavers, the river systems became channelized and denuded. It was a big ecological disaster, taking the wolves out of the system. Now, since they put wolves back in the system, the elk populations declined, but they also behave differently. So instead of hanging out in the river valleys where everything's easy, they move out up into higher areas away from the predators. And the river systems have rebounded massively, and the beavers have moved back in, and the whole system's functioning better. And what's also happened is the mesocarnivores, so the smaller carnivores, are also behaving differently, and their numbers are reducing. So the whole system is actually starting to self-regulate again. It is a really nice rewilding story.
Well, don't forget the farmers around there.
This is true. This is true. Yeah.
Subsidy guarantees from the government, but it's conditional on them keeping the hedge so many meters of the hedgerow. Plant in a hedgerow dies, she has to replace it, and they
Yeah. So this is an important thing. This is keeping connectivity. So the hedgerows are important for connectivity. And actually the whole subsidy system in the EU has improved dramatically recently. So it used to be that farmers got paid per stock unit, which led to overstocking and overgrazing. And they've now taken that away, and farmers are rewarded for good stewardship and ecosystem services. So stock numbers are actually declining. And it's my opinion that some of the big floods in the UK could be at least buffered if the uplands were managed differently with less stock and more woodland elements that could hold water. So this decoupling of subsidy from just meat production will hopefully have a good knock-on effect for a range of ecosystem services. I think there are, and there are also road bridges. Have you seen those? So where a road cuts across the landscape, they've made a wildlife bridge that they've planted so that animals can actually get across. So obviously more animals around the road, you're going to get more roadkill unless you make these safe passages. So the wildlife bridges are actually contiguous with the surrounding landscape so that wildlife can disperse. There was someone...
Last question, because it's already late in the back.
Yeah. Yeah, sure. I mean, greening of cities is a big... there's my colleague Pipin Anderson, if you look at her work in the EGS department here. So making green cities is a big area of research, and there's been massive strides made for that. So how do we, for example, restore rivers as they flow through cities so they become connected again? How can people produce food in their own environment? Can we have more wildlife-friendly gardens with, for example, indigenous species instead of imported species? So I think cities have got a big part in this story as well.